Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of having with us on Brazil Unfiltered Fábio de Silva, who is an associate professor of international studies and the Wick Carey Professor of Brazilian Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He is also affiliated as a fellow at the Harvard Law School Center on Legal Profession. He studies the social organization and the political impact of law and justice in Brazil and comparatively. As an institution builder, Fábio co-directs the Oklahoma University Center for Brazilian Studies, is a member of the executive committee of the Brazilian Studies Association, and a trustee of the Law and Society Association, class of 2023. In 2018, he was recognized as the outstanding faculty in his department. Fábio, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a real honor to be here with you.
So we're now going into the 7th month of Lula's administration. What is your overall evaluation of his first 6 months in office?
Well, Jim, as you know, and I'm sure your audience knows as well, this is the third time that Lula serves as the president of Brazil. He was first elected in 2002. That's about 20 years ago. And comparing nowadays with his first term, the situation for him is much more difficult. There are many challenges that he's facing. And I would say that there are three main or four main challenges. The first one is, of course, the persistence of authoritarian dispositions in Brazilian society, as well as in some institutions, which, as you know, culminated with the events on January 8th. This is the first time that an elected president has to face that kind of resistance to a peaceful transition of power, and this is really unprecedented in contemporary Brazilian history. Second is the fiscal or financial situation. Lula this time inherited a government that whose finances were compromised because Bolsonaro spent a lot of money in 2022 trying to secure his re-election. He failed in this bet, but left really no funds for Lula to pursue the policies that he had promised and that he had been elected to carry on. Third is the political situation, because as you know, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about this, the Brazilian Congress now is very different from it used to be 20 years ago. It's much more conservative. At the same time as it has much more power than it used to have. And finally, the public policies that Brazil developed over the past 30 years or 35 years since the 1988 Constitution were severely damaged by Bolsonaro. So there were areas in which Brazil had made a lot of progress, such as vaccination or even environmental protection, which were completely dismantled by Bolsonaro. So Lula has to rebuild all these important policies, but he doesn't have resources to do it. And he has to face both a more hostile Congress and that kind of authoritarian disposition in Brazilian society, as well as institutions such as the military. So it's really a tough time.
So how's he doing?
Well, I think he's done a good job so far. I mean, given the level of challenges that he's facing. So the economy is responding in a way that I think many analysts did not expect. The dollar has fallen to my disgrace, because I'm currently spending vacation in Brazil. So when I came here, the dollar was 5-1 compared to the Brazilian real, and now it's about 4.77-1. So I lost like 25 cents per US dollar in my budget. The inflation is also going down, which is very important, because that gives more people a better conditions to consume and to pay their bills. Unemployment has fallen too. So the indicators in the economy are very favorable now. which I think is giving people some sense that the choice that they made in the election was the correct one. And in terms of politics, I mean, he's trying to navigate. It's not easy. Like I said, the Congress has much more power than it used to have. The Centrão, which we can talk more about, is now more powerful. There's this president or this chair of the House of Representatives, Arthur Lira, who has a lot of power in his hands and who doesn't give up that power to the executive. And he's trying to negotiate. He's trying to build his coalition in Congress so that he can pass things that are important. He made some important achievements. So, for example, during the transition, he was able to pass a constitutional amendment to secure more funds, which is similar to what Biden was facing there with the raise of the debt ceiling. So Lula had to face this during the transition to his new administration, and he succeeded. And he's now trying to push a tax reform. And it seems like he's going to pass at least part of it, which will help the economy as well. So, I think given, again, the level of the challenges, I think he's doing a great job.
So several weeks ago in the Financial Times, there was an article about the role of the Biden administration in defending the democratic electoral process in Brazil and sending messages that would not support a coup by Bolsonaro's forces. However, the tone of the article indicated that some U.S. government officials were disappointed that this had not brought the two countries closer together. Can you comment on this dynamic between Brazil and the United States?
Sure. And I think I'll start by saying that the support that the U.S. government and the Biden administration gave to democracy in 2022 was indeed very important. I think that one of the reasons why some sectors of the military or the business sector or the press did not join the movement that Bolsonaro and his allies were mounting to promote a coup or an insurrection. One of the main reasons why that did not happen was precisely because there was, unlike in 1964, which is something that you study, the military dictatorship in Brazil in the 60s, unlike in 1964, there was no external support for such a move, both by the United States as well as the rest of the international community. But obviously, the United States has a great importance in this kind of equation. But at the same time, and this is something that I told some colleagues in December, I was in Boston for a conference where the BRICS were being analyzed, and what's going to happen now that Brazil is transitioning to Lula. I told my colleagues there that they should. Obviously, there are many areas in which Brazil and the United States can collaborate, with the U.S. being under a democratic leadership and Brazil being under the Workers' Party leadership, such as the environment and the protection of democracy, but that Brazil would not subject itself to U.S. leadership. And that is for many reasons. One is because that's traditionally the kind of diplomacy that Lula pursues. He wants Brazil to be a more neutral player, and now the U.S. is in direct conflict with other powers like China and Russia. So Lula, the vision that he has for Brazil is to be a mediator in those kinds of disputes rather than a country that is aligned with one or other power. But the other reason, quite frankly, I think is because Brazil has a history with the United States in which there are many wrinkles. And I'm not just talking about 1964, but also about more recent events, including Lava Jato and the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, where a lot of the Brazilian foreign policy analysts see some fingerprints of the United States, and so Lula has been one of the victims of that process, right? I think he's much more skeptical of the United States. So what I told these friends was that if they could, tolerate and work with Brazil as this more kind of independent country that shares important values with the United States, will not subject itself to U.S. leadership, the two countries can accomplish a great deal together.
I was really surprised in the article the way that former Ambassador Shannon was naively surprised that Lula and the Workers' Party had some issues with the United States historically. I wish he had taken my class on the history of Brazil. He would have understood it much better. I think it's kind of very ingenuous on his part, if not cynical. So you talked about Congress. Before we get into the details, why don't you help our listener understand the basic profile of the Congress? When you mentioned the Central, the big center, right. What that is, what is the general composition, without going into too many details. There are 28 parties in the Congress. People will go dizzy trying to understand all of them. But if you could give a general outline, and then we'll talk about the challenges of working with the Congress.
Sure. So unlike the United States, where you have a de facto two-party system, I mean, the United States is technically a multi-party country. There can be many parties. There can be independent candidates being elected. There's even a communist party in the United States. Few people know that, both in the US and outside of the US. But in fact, the parties that get real representation in Congress are the Democrats and the Republicans, right? And so for the president, it's very clear what he or she needs to do after getting elected. I mean, they look at Congress, and if there's a majority of their party represented there, they can pass measures that they deem important. If there isn't a majority, they probably will try to work with some, Congress people who are more sensitive to their concerns, and that's where bipartisanship comes in. Brazil is a very different country. The president is always going to lack that kind of majority, or even the prospect of a majority in Congress. The Workers' Party was elected to the presidency, but it has maybe 100 people in Congress out of 503. So what the president needs to do in that situation is he or she needs to bring other parties to a coalition and form a coalition. That's why the Brazilian system is called coalitional presidentialism. And there are, as you said, many parties represented in Congress, way too many. So, which suggests that the division is not necessarily ideological, right? I mean, obviously you can technically have 28 shades of ideology in a society, but what these 28 parties really represent is more, regional oligarchies, or groups that share the kind of same policy concerns, but don't talk to each other due to local rivalries and so on. And so the president traditionally has tools that he or she can use to co-opt some of these other parties, which again, they are not necessarily ideologically consistent. So, they're not very much concerned with policy issues, but rather with occupying power, right?
Explain, power. Why do they want to be in power? What is the advantage for politicians for being in power in Brazil? Why do they want to be in the government?
Well, you can have more visibility if you have, for example, a cabinet position, right? And this is one of the tools that the presidents have and use to attract those other parties to their coalition. They split their cabinet positions with these other parties, and then a party having access to a certain position in the cabinet, they can promote some policies that will speak to interests, and that will give them a better position in the next electoral cycle. So, I mean, power is being pursued here for the sake of power, but in a number of ways. Obviously, there are some policy concerns, or there are some ideological goals that these parties are pursuing, but in some ways they're pursuing power for the sake of power.
And isn't there also an element of being able to appoint your supporters to different positions in the government? If you're in the ministry of some entity of the government, then you can appoint people. It's a way of getting support from allies and broadening your support as another means of having advantage of being in power.
That happens too, although it has had a diminished role, I would say, in part because of all the corruption scandals that happened more recently. A lot of those positions that could be politically appointed, they are now reserved for public service career personnel. So there's less and less room for those kinds of political appointments. Obviously, at the more senior level, you can appoint somebody to head a unit, but that person doesn't have much power to appoint other people to work in the agency. It could be public servants that they know and that are loyal to them, but really that's a resource that has become more scarce.
Even though under Bolsonaro, 5,000 to 8,000 military officers were appointed to government positions,
yeah. Well, I mean, what happens here is that you have a subset of the public service personnel that has an affiliation, and I would say an ideological affiliation too with Bolsonaro. So that's an advantage that Bolsonaro has, because he could appoint people who fit the criteria, right, that were in place to avoid that kind of purely political appointment, at the same time as he was doing politics through that.
So what are the different major divisions within the Congress, if you could speak in general terms?
Right. So as I was saying, a lot of those parties, they lack a very clear or solid ideological commitment or policy agenda, right? So and a number of those parties, they kind of move according to the incentives that they have. So if the president splits the positions in the cabinet, they'll join the coalition and vote with the president. But what has happened more recently, and this is very important for your listeners to know, is that Congress has become more powerful, and there have been less incentives for those parties to join coalitions with the elected governments. And there were two reasons for that. One is everything that happened since the 2016 impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, which weakened the president. So there were some laws that were approved after Dilma fell that put more budgetary control in the hands of Congress. So the consequence of that is that they now don't need to get close to the chief executive in order to have access to those resources, right? Those budgetary resources. They now have control just by the virtue of being in Congress. Whatever projects they want to support, they can do that through Congress without having to go through the executive. So that means the president has become weaker, and Congress people have become stronger in terms of their ability to control the budgets. And the other thing is, quite frankly, what we are kind of doing here right now. We are talking over the internet, and as we know, social media changed politics a lot. So a lot of those politicians, they don't no longer need to be in the cabinet or to have a position that has been given to them by the chief executive in order to have that kind of visibility that will give them electoral results. They can do that through their Instagram pages or through their social media accounts, YouTube accounts, and so on. And so they have, therefore, less incentive to cooperate with the executive. Quite the opposite. They may have incentives to, be very vocal against the president or against, corruption in general, right? Just because that gives them electoral returns that now can have.
So in the Congress, there's a right bloc that supports Bolsonaro, which is in the clear opposition. And then you mentioned earlier what's called the Centrão, or the big center. And then there's the coalition of the left political parties linked to the Workers' Party that are supporting the government. Tell us a little bit more about the Centrão, because I think we understand the Bolsonaro supporters are out there. They have a large bloc in Congress. They have about 100 deputies that were elected in the last election. What's the big center, the Centrão? What's its composition? What are its politics?
So the Centrão was, as I was saying, this big block of Congress people who don't necessarily have a coherent ideological affiliation, right? And they are more sensitive to that kind of cooptation that presidents can make through distribution of those resources. But like I said, right now they have less incentives to cooperate with the government because they have more control over a lot of those resources that were available to the executive and no longer are. And so now they are, mostly gathered under the leadership of the current.
I guess we can call him the Speaker of the House. Yeah.
Speaker of the House, yeah.
So that's Arturo Lira.
Who's called Arturo Lira, yeah. And, the very reason why he was elected to be the Speaker of the House is because he controls all this big contingent of the Congress people. I mean, it used to be the rule, 10 or 20 years ago that the party that has the biggest number of people in Congress would appoint the Speaker of the House. I mean, there's an election, right? But there was a tradition that the winning candidate would come from the party that has the highest number of people in Congress. That rule was broken in 2014 or 2016 when Eduardo Cunha was elected to be the Speaker of the House, and he was the one who carried out the impeachment of President Rousseff. And ever since then, the Centrão has kind of become the dominant force in Congress, and they've accumulated more and more power. And now they have this very skilled leader, Arturo Lira, who really rivals with Lula in terms of controlling both the budget as well as the policy agenda.
So Lula is known for being an extremely good negotiator. He has a tradition coming from the trade union movement where he had to negotiate contracts with the big automobile companies, international automobile companies, and over the years as a politician. Is he going to succeed? What's your prediction about his skills?
So I think that negotiating skills are no longer the main asset that Lula has. I think what really is counting in his favor is his popularity, which is growing. I mean, he already was a very popular politician, and I don't think that if we had another person running against Bolsonaro, he would have won. The main reason why Bolsonaro was defeated, given how much money he put into the pursuit of his re-election, and given the fact that, as a rule, the incumbent wins in Brazil. This has happened ever since re-election was established in the 90s by Cardoso. So, the tendency was for Bolsonaro to win. And the main reason why he did not win was because he was facing, he made, serious mistakes in the handling of the pandemic and so on. But he was also running against somebody who was very popular. And so, but again, Lula won by a 2 percentage points advantage, right? So it was a very tight election. But his popularity is actually growing ever since he was elected, in part because of, like I said, the economic results that he's obtaining in these first few months. And my reading is that the more Lula becomes popular, the more will be the incentives for Lira to cooperate with him. And not only has Lula become more popular in the last couple of months, but also Lira, might be starting to face some challenges because he's been implicated in some corruption accusations recently it's very early to tell where this is going, but it all stems from his exacerbated control over the budget and the fact that he's supporting some projects that have some indicia of irregularities. But we may see that convergence of Lula becoming more popular and Lira becoming less powerful, and that would give Lula better conditions to really be able to pursue his agenda in the next couple of months.
So historically, the PT has, and many people from the left who supported his government have understood Brazil's development as linked to industrialization, strengthening productive forces, which in the past have actually led to conflicts, for example, about hydroelectric dams and environmental protection. How can we understand Lula's commitment to the environment and his desires for economic development based on the industrialization model? Because I think he's clearly indicating he wants to address the environmental questions, but he also is very concerned about reindustrializing the country. Are these compatible, and how can he manage to play both at the same time?
Well, first of all, I think it is very important to reindustrialize the country. Brazil has gone through a deindustrialization in the past decade or two, and that's not good for the country, and it's not good for many reasons. I mean, one is obviously if you become a commodity exporter primarily, right? That means that what you're producing doesn't have much aggregated value, so the terms of your exchange in the world system, to use a technical expression here, are bad for your country. But the other, I guess, implication of becoming a commodity exporter is that, Bolsonaristas speak with great pride that Brazil is the farm of the world. But there are things that come along with being the farm of the world, including conservatism, because we know that agribusiness in Brazil is extremely conservative. I've traveled in this summer vacation that I'm taking. I'm traveling through the country, and I'm seeing the power of agribusiness. It's really become a thing in the countryside of Brazil, but it has consequences. It brings with it those conservative values, the cult for guns and more, I guess, traditional gender roles and that kind of thing. So it's important for Brazil to reindustrialize, both for economic and political reasons. But I also think that it is possible to make the two goals that you mentioned, reindustrialization and the protection of the environment, compatible. And in fact, just this week I was talking to some friends who are working in the MIDIC, the Ministry for Industrial Development, and one thing that they told me is that they are pursuing, for example, very bold goals in terms of Brazil being able to produce clean energy out of biomass, which could bring all these things together. Greater industrial development, with Brazil being able to add value to some of its commodities that it's producing, as well as the preservation of the environment. So, but you're right that comparing, the third administration of Lula with the previous ones by the PT, especially those in which Dilma Rousseff was the president, there's a heightened concern now with environmental protection, and I think that is translated in the nomination of Marina Silva to the Ministry of Environment, as well as to Sônia Guajajara to the Ministry of the Indigenous Peoples, which was just created. And I think that's very timely, and it's very important. And it's going to force Brazil to pursue that kind of innovation in terms of its policy. Industrialization is important, but we can't simply reproduce the formula that were used both in the 50s or 60s, and even some of the military government, and during the PT administrations, which was based on funding some national champions through public banks and really prioritizing some areas that do not necessarily have that concern with environmental protection.
So Lula spent a lot of time traveling abroad to rebuild Brazil's international status. Has this weakened his possibilities of strengthening his support at home, do you think?
I think that can be a double edged sword. It can actually help him domestically. I mean, just recently, Lula traveled to Europe and he went to France and he gave wonderful speeches in France that really resonated well domestically, right? There are times when he can make some mistakes in those travels and make points that actually give the opposition, right, an asset, a talking point to repeat during the entire week in Congress. So, but I guess everybody recognizes that there's a big difference in terms of Brazil's stature and level of respect between Bolsonaro and Lula. During the Bolsonaro years, Brazil was a pariah, as his Minister of Foreign Affairs actually said that it was his goal to be, right. And right after Lula was elected, everybody could notice that Brazil began immediately to be called to all these meetings and to be the president was then visited or invited to visit other important leaders. So I think everybody realizes that Brazil is better off with Lula internationally. But at the same time, it needs to deliver domestically as well to not create that feeling that Lula has become more of a global leader than somebody who will solve the problems that the country has.
Fábio, as a lawyer, you've written about the judiciary and the role of the prosecuting attorneys and judges in relationships to the Operation Car Wash, the Lava Jato investigations about alleged corruption by the PT governments. Could you share your thoughts about that process and its overall impact on politics in Brazil?
Yeah, we actually could record an entire episode of this podcast talking about Lava Jato, because it was really an extensive process that I've done a lot of research on. I focus more on the impacts of Lava Jato on politics and democracy. And my conclusions, have been very damning to the operation. I think that Lava Jato helped pave the way for the far-right turn that Brazil took as of 2018 with the election of Bolsonaro. I mean, and in many ways, the election of Bolsonaro was a culmination of a process in which Lava Jato was deeply implicated. So one of the ways in which I base this argument is through my research on the discourse that the agents of Lava Jato, especially the prosecutors, mobilized throughout the operation, and how that discourse, while many people were understanding, the operation as the triumph of the rule of law and the end of impunity, what I demonstrate was that their discourse was already, very antithetical to political liberalism. And the other study that I did looks at the role of these prosecutors in social media and what kinds of values they helped to promote. I take, their public intervention very seriously, and I look deeply into the kind of cultural repertoire that they helped instill in the Brazilian polity. And so, I found, for example, that back in 2017 or 2018, before Bolsonaro was elected, the pages of these prosecutors were already disseminating, for example, the contempt for rule of law institutions, including the Supreme Court, which, if you think about this more carefully, you will see that it's something that Bolsonarismo also made very central, right? And the attacks on the Supreme Court and the attacks on the institutions that we observed in January 8th actually owe a lot to that process of deconstruction of institutions that Lava Jato did.
So Let me ask the question. Is there a long-term problem of corruption in Brazil? And if so, how can it be addressed?
There is, of course, and in part, this is, because of Brazil's very shallow experience with democracy, right? This is the longest time in which Brazil has lived under a democratic regime, the one that we are currently living in. And even then, we had all these hiccups, right? But of course, if you don't have a democracy, if you have a military dictatorship, you don't have a means through which the people can actually control those in office, right? If you're a former colony in which power was strongly concentrated in the hands of a few people, there's going to be room there for corruption. So Brazil has a really a long-term problem of corruption. And the way it had been addressed until Lava Jato was through, and this is what I think is the most effective way in response to your question, was through incremental institutional reform. I mean, Brazil, since 1988, but especially since Cardoso and then Lula pursued successfully a lot of important institutional reforms that made things more transparent, that shrinked the space for corruption in the budgetary process and so on. And this is how Brazil was moving along its way. I won't say out of corruption, because it's impossible for a country to not have corruption, but in its way toward a more ethical environment for politics and the handling of public affairs. And then Lava Jato came in, and they thought that they could run a crusade against corruption through the legal process. And they thought that Brazil needed a kind of big bang approach, that it would make the system collapse. And out of that, something much more virtuous would come up. And I think that was their mistake, because the legal process is a very limited instrument for a country to fight corruption with. And what they eventually ended up doing was to really stretch the law to pursue a political agenda, and that's a risk that you always run when you are thinking about transforming a society through law. I think we need to get back to where we were before Lava Jato, which again is through incremental institutional change that is pursued democratically, and that doesn't put in the hands of prosecutors and the judge the mission of cleaning the country.
So the Brazilian Congress is currently having an investigative committee that's looking into the January 8th invasion by Bolsonaro supporters of the seats of power in Brasilia. What's the current political force of Bolsonaro and his supporters in Brazil, at your point?
I think Bolsonaro is going to have, about 20 or 25% of support in Brazil. If not Bolsonaro, whoever represents this, more kind of far-right camp in politics. I mean, they are here to stay, right? And we'll have to deal with the presence of a more radicalized sector of the population that doesn't really espouse democratic values and that doesn't really embrace human rights and democracy.
Fábio, what do you think might be the results of the investigative commission on the invasion of January 8th?
So I think the results of the commission could be something like what we had in the United States in the investigative commission over the January 6th attacks. More awareness among the people about the nature of Bolsonarismo, about how much contempt they have for democracy, for the rule of law, and of how dangerous they can be, to the future of the country. And I think if we combine that with a successful third term of Lula, with Lula being able to deliver some of his promises, improve the economy, restore the agenda of social inclusion, and even advance some of those more futuristic agendas that we were talking about here, reindustrialization and environmental protection. I think this combination can really put the country back on track and maybe give an incentive to the center right to set Bolsonaro and Bolsonarismo aside and really engage in a political dispute that is more centered around those values that should be above left or right ideology.
Fábio, what an amazingly good interview with you today. I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you so much, Jim. Again, like I said, this is an honor. And, I should thank you for your service to bringing to the English-speaking audience so much good quality information through your work and podcast.
Thank you so much. So I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.